Can the government afford its subsidy bill? This has come into special focus after an uproar in Parliament over the increase in the prices of petroleum and diesel. But many economic commentators have said that the fuel subsidy bill especially is a bill that the government can't afford, and besides, it isn't even helping those that it's meant for. Let's go across to my colleague Shweta Rajpal Kohli to take us through how the government's subsidy bill actually breaks down in this economic environment. Shweta, go ahead.
Well, Barkha, the current economic environment has clearly added to the government woes. And if I could specifically talk about the fuel subsidy bill that is clearly mounting, three factors why it's become almost impossible for the government to avoid any further fuel price hikes. One, of course, is international crude prices that have shot up, and the situation in Syria is clearly not helping. Of course, the rupee depreciation, which is the clear big factor why we are seeing the overall import bill going completely out of hand. We've seen the rupee depreciation. Now, every time the rupee depreciates by 1 rupee against the dollar, we see the import bill of the government going up by 8,000 crore rupees. And already we are talking about losses of about 1,80,000 crores for the oil marketing companies in this fiscal. Now, that's clearly unsustainable, because remember, these may be losses to the oil marketing companies, but it's ultimately the government that will have to compensate those oil marketing companies. And of course, the food subsidy bill, which has been very controversial, will not help the situation either. We know that in this fiscal we may not see the hit as much, but at the end of the day, the government has to account for the food subsidy bill. Many economic commentators again saying that the timing couldn't have been worse to bring in the food subsidy bill. But overall, the subsidy bill of the government, the total subsidy bill of the government is something that has got economists around the world worried about India, because they say the fiscal deficit is rising. India simply cannot afford to carry on like that. And the one subsidy that everyone recommends that we need to do away with is fuel subsidy. And that's why a much sharper increase in diesel prices is what is being argued, is the need of the hour. But politically, can the government get it through at a time when elections are around the corner remains the big question.
Well, Shweta, given the response in Parliament, the answer to that question would be no, and a categorical no. And the real problem with fuel subsidies is not so much that the subsidy is helping the poor, but the analysis in many different quarters that actually the fuel subsidy is helping the elite or the upper middle class. Let's just take a look at the statistics from a recent IMF study, Shweta, and if you can comment on this. And this actually says that the top 20% of Indian households capture 6 times more in benefits from fuel subsidies than the poorest 20%. So the question then is fuel subsidies helping the poor, or is it subsidizing the SUV class?
Absolutely, and that's been the main argument, Barkha, by those who say that fuel subsidies are the so-called useless subsidies which need to be done away with. In fact, there are some policymakers like Montek who've argued that you actually need to do away with fuel subsidies to make way for food subsidies, because food subsidies is something that's clearly targeting the poor. But fuel subsidies is something where, because of the leakages, we're seeing that the intended beneficiaries are not getting the benefit of the fuel subsidies. And specifically in diesel, there are enough people who are arguing that actually you're subsidizing those people who are driving the diesel guzzling SUVs. And do they really need subsidized diesel? Every time we line up at a fuel station, and every time an oil marketing company sells a liter of diesel, they're actually losing well over 10 rupees per liter. So is that the kind of loss that we can afford at a time when the economy is in a complete tailspin? That remains a larger question. But we've even seen this kind of reaction coming to a mere 50 paise hike in diesel prices. And you saw what happened in Parliament today. The opposition is likely to continue, whereas the economic commentators seem to argue that we need to go in for at least a 5 rupee hike. Besides that, there are arguments coming in on the overall revenue foregone, and many who continue to argue that, well, on one hand, you've got subsidies and you're wondering if you can really afford a food subsidy bill. But what about the revenue foregone, which are the so-called implicit subsidies?
I was going to ask you exactly about those, Shweta, because the larger philosophical heart of this debate is actually over whether every time the urban Indian complains actually about the state of the economy, is she willing to give up her subsidy? And I ask that because we have had also papers that are now looking at the revenue foregone, for example, of gold, that runs well over 60,000 crores if you look at that revenue foregone. And then you have the left of center economists who will argue that, see, this is the urban middle class that only cribs when the poor are subsidized, never when their SUVs are subsidized, and never when gold, for example, is foregone. So what's the counter argument to that?
That's right, absolutely, Barkha, and that's the larger argument. Many would actually say that, you know what, we can afford the food subsidy bill, just do away with some of those tax breaks, the rebates that you're giving to the corporates, to the rich, and they clearly don't need it. There are others who would argue that, you know what, those tax rebates actually lead to heightened economic activity and in turn help the economy. So it is a very sensitive debate, especially something that is being brought up ever since the government started reporting those revenue foregone numbers from 2007 onwards, and the numbers are startling. But is that something that can be compared to the overall subsidy bill where we only look at food, fuel and fertilizer? That remains a larger question. There are no easy choices here. Should you be taking away some of these rebates and tax breaks which come under the so-called hidden subsidies or the implicit subsidies, as many would like to term it, or would that lead to a further economic mess? Gold, for instance, you mentioned on the custom duty on gold and diamonds, the revenue foregone is 61,000 crore rupees. Now, these are questions that are obviously being raised by people at a time when they're saying unusual circumstances demand unusual responses from the government. But for now, the focus clearly remains on fuel subsidies, which have become clearly unaffordable for the government. 1,80,000 crore rupees. Should you and I be actually subsidized for our cooking gas, for our diesel? That remains the larger question.
Well, that's not a question that politicians at least seem to want to tackle. An uproar in Parliament today. Shweta Rajpal Kohli, thanks so much. An uproar in Parliament today over the hike in petroleum and diesel prices, as many are saying that actually you need a much greater hike in diesel prices. On the program today, let's take you now to our special debate. We're asking whether subsidies are pro-poor or anti-growth, and doesn't it depend on which kind of subsidy? Is it time to do away with some subsidies, especially the fuel subsidy? Let's introduce a panel this evening. From Bangalore tonight is Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, one of our best-known corporate voices and the head, of course, of Biocon India Limited. With me in the studio is Ashok Gulati. He is the chairman of the Commission for Agriculture Cost and Prices and has done some very interesting number crunches on the actual cost of the food security bill and how 40% so far in the PDS system has been failing to reach its target. Also joining us from Bangalore, Rajiv Gaura, spokesperson of the Congress Party, also a professor at IIM Bangalore. With me in the Delhi studios is Dinesh Bhai Trivedi, Member of Parliament with the Trinamool Congress. The Trinamool Congress today creating a storm over that increase in fuel prices. And also joining me tonight is MB Rajesh, Member of Parliament with the CPM, and Harsh Mandar, writer and activist and somebody who's worked very hard to push the food security bill through, which we're expecting by the end of today. Kiran Shaw, let me start with you. The larger debate over subsidies, but when you break it down and you look at, for example, the fuel subsidy bill, and you have people pointing out that the fuel subsidy, look at the latest IMF report. The IMF report saying, and I'll just repeat this again, the top 20% of Indian households capture 6 times more in benefits from fuel subsidies than the poorest 20%. Yet an increase in fuel prices seems like such a political hot potato, and the urban middle class cribs immediately because it seems to want a subsidy for itself while denying, some would say, the poor the kind of subsidy they're getting under the food security bill. Do you believe there's a hypocrisy, a social hypocrisy in our response to subsidies?
You know, Barkha, I want to respond to that question in 2 ways. One is, I certainly don't think we can afford not to raise fuel prices and not to really subsidize them at the level we are today. There is no debate on that, because the way we are taking this economy, we just cannot afford all the things we are trying to do. But coming back to the food security bill, as we've all discussed, you know, subsidies are palliative. They are not curative in terms of alleviating poverty.
Yes.
And personally, I think we are really evading the main issue. We have not created jobs. I think that is the real fundamental issue that is declining our economic growth. I think that's where the government has failed. We have not created jobs, and that's why we are having this huge issue and the huge challenge that we are facing today. I mean, let me tell you that the food security bill is very badly timed. This is a time when our fiscal deficit, as the finance minister says, is going to be contained at any cost. That means we will stop spending and investing in economic growth. What are we doing?
But
our
Kiran,
economy is, shrinking.
Yes.
And let me just finish, Barkha.
Yeah.
To me, economic growth is vital for, the poverty alleviation.